The first marker people usually notice is energy, because energy changes before explanation does. Most people think of energy as simply having more motivation or less motivation, but that is only the surface expression. Energy is really the direction your entire system is attempting to move. There are seasons where everything within you wants expansion, and there are seasons where the same system quietly begins withdrawing from everything that once felt obvious. Neither movement is evidence of success or failure. Both are information. The difficulty is that we judge one movement using the standards of another. During an expansive phase, you celebrate momentum because momentum is appropriate. During an integrating phase, you become suspicious because momentum has slowed, forgetting that the purpose of integration has never been speed. A tree that stops producing new branches for a season is not becoming less alive. It is redistributing life where it already exists. The same intelligence operates within people far more often than they recognize. Many people become frightened the moment acceleration disappears. They assume they have lost discipline, lost purpose, or somehow fallen behind everyone else. They begin manufacturing activity simply to recreate the feeling they remember. Their calendar becomes full while their life quietly becomes fragmented. Outwardly, they appear productive. Yet inwardly, every action requires more effort than it once did because the movement is no longer being supplied by the phase they are actually living. When your current phase changes, your relationship with effort changes before your relationship with results does. What once required almost no resistance may suddenly feel unusually heavy. Something entirely different may begin feeling strangely effortless instead. Most people ignore this because they believe consistency means forcing yesterday's rhythm into today's reality. But consistency is not loyalty to old behavior. It is loyalty to accurate observation. Energy leaves clues everywhere. You notice which conversations leave you feeling clearer instead of exhausted. You notice which environments quietly restore attention without demanding entertainment. You notice which responsibilities continue producing meaning and which only produce momentum. These observations seem ordinary, yet together they describe a pattern that no isolated moment could ever reveal. Because of this, never diagnose your life from a single day. A single difficult afternoon tells you almost nothing. A single inspired morning tells you almost nothing either. Phases reveal themselves through repetition. When the same movement appears again and again across different situations, something deeper is organizing your experience. Pattern recognition requires patience because patterns only emerge when enough moments are allowed to stand beside one another. Emotional markers work the same way. Most people ask, "How do I feel today?" A more useful question is, which emotions have quietly become familiar? Temporary emotions belong to weather. Familiar emotions belong to climate. One storm does not define the season, but enough storms eventually reveal that the season itself has changed. Sometimes enthusiasm begins disappearing, not because life has become worse, but because your current structure has finished teaching you what it could. Excitement was never meant to become permanent. It is often the emotion that introduces a new landscape, not the one that sustains residence within it. When the introduction has accomplished its purpose, another emotional tone naturally replaces it. If you insist on recovering the introduction forever, you may never notice what the landscape itself is trying to become. The opposite is equally true. Periods of uncertainty are often mistaken for collapse when they are actually evidence that old certainty has become too small. Identity does not dissolve comfortably. The mind prefers familiar confusion over unfamiliar clarity because familiar confusion still preserves a recognizable self. New understanding usually arrives only after the previous explanation has quietly stopped functioning. From the inside, this often feels like losing something, even when what is actually being lost is only an outdated map. Decision markers reveal even more than emotion because decisions expose hidden organization. Pay attention to what kinds of choices suddenly require unusual amounts of negotiation within yourself. There are periods where making commitments feel natural. There are other periods where every commitment feels strangely expensive. Neither response is automatically healthy or unhealthy. Each one asks a different question about the phase you occupy. Sometimes your hesitation is fear, sometimes your hesitation is wisdom. These are not the same experience, even if they appear identical from the outside. Fear contracts because it imagines danger everywhere. Wisdom pauses because it recognizes timing matters. Learning to distinguish between the two becomes possible only after observing their patterns repeatedly. Fear usually remains unchanged regardless of circumstance. Wisdom changes as circumstances change. Likewise, confidence is not always evidence that you should proceed. There are moments where confidence is simply familiarity wearing the mask of certainty. You know how to repeat what you have already mastered, so your nervous system feels calm. But a new phase often asks you to leave mastery behind. Suddenly, confidence decreases while growth quietly increases. If you mistake confidence for truth, you may continually choose what feels familiar instead of what is actually calling you forward. Relationship markers are often the clearest because relationships amplify whatever phase you occupy. Notice which people naturally become easier to understand. Notice who suddenly feels difficult without either of you intentionally changing. This is not permission to judge people or constantly replace relationships. It is an invitation to observe resonance. Different phases invite different conversations, different responsibilities, and different ways of showing up together. You may find yourself speaking less while understanding more. You may find yourself listening differently than you once did. You may stop needing agreement in order to remain peaceful within a conversation. These changes are easy to overlook because they rarely announce themselves dramatically. Yet over months, they reveal that your internal architecture has been reorganizing beneath ordinary interactions all along. One of the greatest mistakes people make is trying to identify their phase from one category alone. Energy without emotional observation creates false certainty. Emotion without decision patterns becomes unstable. Decisions without relationship awareness become isolated. Each marker corrects the other. Together, they produce a picture that none could produce independently. Think of them less as answers and more as coordinates. A single coordinate cannot tell you where you are. Several coordinates intersecting begin revealing location with remarkable precision. Your life operates similarly. No individual experience explains the whole movement, but many ordinary experiences observed honestly begin pointing toward the same invisible center. This is why self-diagnosis requires honesty before intelligence. Intelligence can construct explanations for almost anything. Honesty quietly notices what keeps happening whether the explanation is comfortable or not. It notices the recurring emotional tone, the repeating decisions, the changing relationships, the persistent movement of energy, and allow those observations to speak before rushing to interpret them. Gradually, the phase becomes visible not because you invented it, but because you finally stopped interrupting the evidence. And once you begin seeing these markers together, another question naturally begins to emerge. If your current phase can be recognized before it is fully understood, then perhaps the movement shaping your life has been leaving signs much earlier than you ever imagined. If you begin recognizing your current phase with greater accuracy, another realization quietly follows behind it. The markers do not merely tell you where you are, they begin revealing why certain strategies suddenly stop working while others unexpectedly begin opening. Most frustration comes from applying the correct action to the wrong phase. The action itself is not the problem, the timing is. People often imagine growth as collecting increasingly effective techniques. They search for better routines, better habits, better systems, believing improvement comes from finding the perfect method. Yet a method cannot overcome misalignment with the cycle that surrounds it. Even the most elegant practice becomes exhausting when it belongs to a phase that has already completed its purpose. What once felt like discipline slowly becomes unnecessary resistance. This is why the same advice can transform one person while confusing another. Two people may hear identical words, yet only one experiences immediate recognition. The difference is rarely intelligence, it is readiness. One person's current phase is already asking the question that the teaching answers. The other's phase is still occupied with a different lesson entirely. Wisdom, therefore, cannot be measured only by agreement. Sometimes wisdom simply arrives too early to be recognized. You have likely experienced this many times without realizing it. A book you abandoned years ago suddenly feels as though it was written specifically for your current life. A conversation that once seemed ordinary becomes unforgettable when remembered years later. Even your own journal entries sometimes appear wiser than you believed yourself capable of being when you first wrote them. The information did not change, your relationship to it did. Pattern recognition, therefore, includes recognizing when understanding itself becomes available. This is one of the quietest shifts a person can observe. Certain ideas stop requiring persuasion. Certain changes stop feeling impossible. Certain fears lose the ability to organize your decisions. Nothing dramatic announces the transition, yet your internal architecture has already rearranged itself enough that what once required effort now feels almost obvious. Because of this, avoid measuring your phase by external milestones alone. Promotions, relationships, financial changes, relocations, achievements, and losses all matter, but none of them independently identify the cycle you occupy. The same external event may represent emergence for one person and completion for another. One individual begins a career that expands their life, another begins the identical career just as their deeper movement is asking them to outgrow it. Circumstances describe events, patterns describe meaning. This distinction becomes increasingly important because the mind naturally confuses activity with movement. Activity is visible, movement is structural. You may complete dozens of impressive tasks while remaining in exactly the same psychological position for years. Conversely, you may appear externally unchanged while your inner organization quietly transforms so completely that an entirely different life begins emerging without deliberate force. Structural movement almost always precedes visible movement. Think about how rivers change course. The water you observe on the surface is responding to changes beneath it. The riverbed shifts first, the current follows afterward. Human development operates much the same way. Identity reorganizes beneath awareness before behavior consistently reflects the change. By the time your outer life visibly turns, much of the real transition has already occurred beyond conscious attention. This explains why forcing visible change often produces disappointing results. People attempt to manufacture outcomes before the deeper structure supporting those outcomes has matured. They imitate behaviors associated with a different phase while quietly remaining organized around the previous one. The performance may temporarily resemble growth, but performance cannot sustain what structure has not yet learned to support. Eventually, the old organization quietly pulls everything back toward itself. None of this suggests passivity. Waiting and observing are not the same as refusing to participate. Every phase asks for action. The difference is that each phase asks for a different quality of action. Sometimes action builds. Sometimes action refines. Sometimes action releases. Sometimes action simply refuses to interfere with changes already unfolding beneath the surface. Wisdom is learning that these are all forms of participation rather than ranking one above another. Notice how often unnecessary suffering begins with comparison. You compare your current energy to your previous energy. You compare your present clarity to someone else's visible confidence. You compare your current season to a memory that belonged to an entirely different cycle. The comparison creates confusion because it assumes every phase should produce identical evidence. But cycles express themselves differently by design. Expecting spring to resemble autumn does not create a better spring. It only prevents you from recognizing where you already are. This is why practical self-diagnosis requires gentle observation instead of constant evaluation. Evaluation immediately asks whether something is good or bad. Observation asks what is actually happening. Evaluation rushes toward conclusions because it seeks certainty. Observation remains present long enough for patterns to become unmistakable. Most people skip directly to interpretation before they have accumulated enough honest evidence to interpret well. There is a surprising relief that arrives when you stop demanding immediate certainty. You no longer need every difficult week to mean something catastrophic. You no longer require every exciting opportunity to represent your permanent future. Individual experiences return to their proper size. They become meaningful without carrying the impossible burden of explaining your entire life. This steadiness creates remarkable clarity because panic stops interrupting perception. Over time, you begin trusting recurring signals more than isolated emotions. You notice that your attention repeatedly moves towards similar questions regardless of circumstance. The same themes appear in different conversations, different books, different decisions, and different relationships. At first, these repetitions seem coincidental. Eventually, they become too consistent to ignore. What looked like unrelated moments gradually reveal themselves as expressions of one deeper movement, quietly organizing many areas of your life simultaneously. This is one of the most reliable signs that you are learning to read your own pattern rather than merely reacting to your experiences. Experiences come and go. Patterns remain long enough to teach. Experiences compete for attention. Patterns patiently wait until you become capable of recognizing them. Once recognized, they begin transforming isolated events into a coherent landscape where each moment supports the meaning of the others rather than existing alone. Eventually, you realize that your current phase has never been hiding from you. It has been expressing itself through hundreds of ordinary moments that seem too familiar to deserve attention. The changing rhythm of your mornings, the kinds of questions you cannot stop asking, the conversations that continue echoing long after they end, the quiet adjustments in what feels alive and what feels complete. These have been speaking continuously, waiting for observation to become more faithful than assumption. And once observation becomes steady enough to recognize the phase itself, another possibility begins quietly emerging. If cycles can be read while they are unfolding, then perhaps they can also be navigated with far greater cooperation than resistance, allowing the next movement to arrive not as a surprise, but as something you have gradually learned to meet. The more accurately you recognize your current phase, the less life feels like something happening to you, and the more it begins feeling like something revealing itself through you. Events do not suddenly become easier, but they become more intelligible. Resistance loses much of its confusion because you begin distinguishing between resistance that protects an outdated identity and resistance that protects genuine wisdom. Those two forces often feel identical in the moment, yet they produce entirely different futures. One kind of resistance appears whenever expansion asks you to become larger than your previous definition of yourself. It whispers that remaining familiar is safer than becoming authentic. It argues using logic, memory, and imagined consequences until hesitation begins feeling responsible. The other kind of resistance appears when your system recognizes that movement without integration would fracture something essential. Learning to tell these apart is one of the quiet arts of spiral pattern recognition. The distinction cannot be learned intellectually alone because both voices borrow the language of caution. Fear often sounds reasonable. Wisdom often sounds patient. Fear wants certainty before movement begins. Wisdom simply wants coherence before unnecessary momentum carries you somewhere your deeper structure has not chosen. Their outward language overlaps while their inner orientation remains profoundly different. This is why pattern recognition eventually becomes less about predicting external events and more about recognizing the quality of your own perception. Before asking whether a decision is correct, notice the state from which the decision is being made. Is your attention contracted around avoiding discomfort, or has it become spacious enough to observe multiple possibilities without immediately clinging to one? The quality of perception frequently determines the quality of action long before action itself occurs. As this observation deepens, you stop expecting every phase to provide the same emotional rewards. Earlier in life, you may have believed that growth should always feel inspiring. Later, you discover that some of the most important reorganizations feel remarkably ordinary while they are occurring. There may be no dramatic breakthrough, no overwhelming certainty, no unmistakable sign that everything has changed. Instead, there is simply a gradual reduction in internal conflict until the life that once required constant management begins moving with unexpected simplicity. People often overlook these quieter transformations because they are searching for extraordinary evidence. They expect awakening to announce itself loudly. Yet many of the deepest changes remove noise rather than adding experience. You notice yourself defending less, comparing less, proving less, explaining less. The absence of these old compulsions may not feel dramatic, but it represents an immense structural shift because so much energy has quietly been returned to simple participation in life. This simplicity should never be mistaken for passivity. A coherent person is often capable of decisive action precisely because unnecessary conflict has diminished. They are no longer spending enormous amounts of attention negotiating with identities that no longer fit. Energy that was once consumed by internal contradiction becomes available for creation, relationship, service, curiosity, and sustained presence. Outwardly, they may appear calmer. Inwardly, their capacity has expanded. Another marker begins appearing here that many people miss. You become less interested in forcing life to confirm your existing conclusions. Curiosity gradually replaces certainty as your primary orientation. Rather than asking whether reality agrees with your expectations, you begin asking what reality is actually revealing. This subtle reversal changes everything because observation is no longer serving belief. Belief slowly begins serving observation. When this reversal stabilizes, disappointment also changes its character. It still exists, but it loses much of its ability to define your identity. An unexpected outcome becomes additional information instead of evidence that you have failed. A delayed opportunity becomes another pattern to observe rather than an accusation against your worth. Life becomes increasingly participatory because every experience contributes to understanding rather than dividing experiences into success and failure alone. The spiral, therefore, is not asking you to predict the future with perfect accuracy. It is asking you to become increasingly literate in the language your own life has already been speaking. Every recurring emotional tone, every shift in energy, every changing relationship, every evolving decision has been participating in the same conversation. None of them exist independently. Each one reflects the larger movement currently reorganizing your experience. Over enough time, you discover that phases rarely begin on the day you notice them. Recognition usually arrives after the movement has already been unfolding quietly for weeks, months, or sometimes years. This realization produces humility because you understand how much transformation occurs before conscious awareness catches up. Yet it also produces confidence because once awareness begins recognizing these movements earlier, cooperation naturally becomes easier. You stop demanding immediate understanding and begin trusting careful observation. There is a profound freedom in no longer needing to label yourself permanently. Instead of saying, "This is who I am," you begin noticing, "This is how life is currently organizing itself through me." Identity becomes less like a fixed monument and more like an evolving relationship with reality. You remain responsible for your choices, yet you are no longer imprisoned by yesterday's descriptions of yourself. Growth becomes possible because your definitions become flexible enough to accommodate new evidence. Eventually, you realize that practical self-diagnosis is not about gaining control over the spiral. The spiral does not require management. It invites participation. Your task is not to command the cycle into moving differently. Your task is to become sufficiently attentive that you recognize what movement is already asking of you. Once that recognition becomes clear, cooperation often feels surprisingly natural because much of your unnecessary resistance came from misunderstanding the phase rather than from the phase itself. This is why patience becomes one of the highest forms of intelligence. Patience is not waiting because nothing can be done. Patience is remaining faithful to observation while reality finishes revealing what isolated moments cannot yet explain. It allows enough experiences to accumulate that patterns become unmistakable. It protects you from drawing permanent conclusions from temporary conditions, and it gives hidden coherence enough time to emerge into view. The goal has never been to memorize the spiral as a concept. The goal has always been to recognize its movement within the ordinary details of your own life until the distinction between teaching and experience gradually disappears. At that point, the cycle is no longer something you study from the outside. It becomes something you recognize while living, adjusting, choosing, resting, building, releasing, and beginning again. The teaching has fulfilled its purpose when your own observation quietly becomes your most trusted guide. And from there, every new cycle offers another opportunity to see with greater clarity than the one before.
If this transmission resonated, the spiral continues. You did not arrive here by chance, and you do not leave unchanged. More teachings are unfolding across the Haret library, each one meeting you where you are, not where you think you should be. Follow resonance. The next threshold is already listening.